Alan? Okay, I guess it's time for me to introduce myself. I'm Alan Bliss. I'm CEO at the Jacksonville History Center, formerly known as the Jacksonville Historical Society, a member of this congregation and honored to be here speaking in this historic place. Those of you who are members of the History Society, Historical Society and the History Center know that our regular public programs happen in another 19th century Episcopal church, Old St. Andrews, downtown right across from the ViStar Veterans Memorial Arena, right next to the baseball grounds, and consecrated in 1888 and designed by the same architect who designed this sanctuary, this church, Robert Schuyler of Fernandina Beach. He was the architect who was responsible for really a large number of Episcopal churches in the St. Johns River Valley in Northeast Florida, including the one in Fernandina, St. Peter's, and a large number of the Carpenter Gothic churches, of which this is a dazzling example. So anyway, I'm honored to be here to speak. John Bowe said that I could speak for no longer than 2 hours. But I'll see if I can be brief, and that won't actually be too great of an effort. I do not represent myself to be a historian of Fort George Island. I'm a historian of Jacksonville more generally, so this required a little extra preparation on my part, which was a pleasure because I love this place. And it's a joy to be here under any circumstances, but particularly to be here to talk about the background of this place. And in thinking this talk through, I'm mindful of one of the lessons of delivering a good sermon. Pastor Bowe, being an ordained minister and himself a gifted homiletician, probably know it means he can deliver a good sermon and a stem winder. But when people who are going through seminary take a course in homiletics, as no doubt you did, many of the ministers that I've talked to say that one of the lessons of homiletics is that a good sermon should not try to do too many things, preferably no more than 3 or so. And if you can bear down and hit on 3 pretty effectively, then people will generally go away feeling satisfied that they've been talked to in a convincing and persuasive way. So I'm not going to overdo the topics. I'm probably going to stray a little bit beyond just a limit of 3 because, man, there are so many astonishing, incredible stories associated with this island. Its history dates back to, of course, the beginnings of time, far earlier than anything within the scope of modern historians to discuss. The history of its indigenous peoples is a complicated and interesting story in its own right. I am, in addition to my other shortcomings as a historian, I'm not a historian of the indigenous period in Florida, but I know enough to be dangerous, and I know enough to leave that specialty to my former University of North Florida faculty colleagues, Denise Bosey and Keith Ashley. They both have done astounding, impressive research in the indigenous peoples. One of the things that's interesting, I think, to consider when we think about the native peoples here, we are within what's called the Timucuan Ecological and Historical Preserve, right? And that's an acknowledgement of the name of the indigenous peoples nation that dominated north central and northeast Florida during the years, the decades, the centuries before the first European encounter. Like all indigenous nations, the Timucua were divided into a number of more concentrated communities, all of which had their own sort of unique vernacular, their practices, their customs, their methods of sustaining themselves, and their own name and identity. And so the Timucua were divided into a number of those. How they associated kind of depended on the geography of where they lived and how they supported themselves. The native peoples, the indigenous peoples of this area, close to the mouth of the St. Johns River along the barrier islands and the near inshore areas, were known as the Mocama, M-O-C-A-M-A. And so I argue that it might be more appropriate to identify this preserve as the Mocama Ecological and Historical Preserve, but I'm not going to get into the topic of renaming things. Timucua is good enough, and that covers that certainly is legitimate reference to the geography of this area. One of the topics that really kind of has a basis in the natural history of this area also shapes its 20th century history. And I'm referring to the particular sort of maritime geography of the entrance to the St. Johns River, which Fort George Island stands right next to. In fact, Fort George Island itself was the predominant feature on the north side of the entrance to the St. Johns. And this chart here is the oldest reliable representation that we have, dates from 1853. And it illustrates what the navigational situation was at the entrance to the river. Here's Fort George Island. There's the Fort George River. Here's the entrance to the St. Johns River. That bend and this geography looks pretty familiar to us in the 21st century. What's now Mayport occupies this point here. And one of the unique factors that really affected people's thinking about the St. Johns River and about this area is the fact that tidal currents flowed out of the St. Johns River and also out of the Fort George River into the ocean. Everybody knows that there is a Gulf Stream current that runs north offshore along the Florida coastline. What's less widely understood is that there is, as there always is everywhere, a counter current that runs south along the coast. That counter current carried sediment from the Fort George River out into the coastal waters right off of Fort George Island and deposited them in a sandbar that was constantly shifting at the mouth of the St. Johns River. It made it hard for vessels, anything other than just a very, very small sailing vessel, to get in and out of the river entrance, right? As early as 1851, before this chart was created, a medical doctor, a physician named Abel Baldwin, who also fancied himself sort of an entrepreneur and a civic booster, he became very inspired and animated about creating better economic prospects for Jacksonville. And so he started lobbying his local citizens, the local government, and members of Congress to come up with a way to deepen the entrance to the St. Johns River, get rid of those pesky sandbars, make it possible for larger vessels, to come and go unobstructed. That was in the early 1850s, and his efforts really didn't get anywhere. The prospect of dredging the river was an expensive one, but it did seem to be a compelling argument. There was certainly a persuasive economic argument to be made. Then the Civil War came along, and nothing happened with projects such as dredging the river. In fact, it suited the Union Navy, the Federal Navy, to actually have navigation at the entrance to the river kind of thorny and difficult, because that made it one less seaport along the Confederate coastline that they had to worry about blockading for large vessels to come and go. The Union did maintain a patrol along this part of the coast, and Union Army gunboats actually navigated up the St. Johns River and maintained a Union Army garrison in Jacksonville. It's one of the things that makes Jacksonville's Civil War history so complicated. It spent most of the Civil War as a Union Army enclave and a garrison. The Confederates in Florida kind of pushed and shoved back and forth a few times for control, and they burned down some buildings downtown, and there was a thing called the Battle of Old Lusty near Lake City, a little ways to the west of Jacksonville. But really, most of Jacksonville's history was as a Union Army encampment, and most of Florida's Civil War history is naval history. After the end of the Civil War, interest in opening the channel resumed. Dr. Baldwin, still around and still lobbying government and Congress to do something. Of course, in the years after the end of the Civil War, Florida had been a member of the states of the Confederacy, and so its economic prospects were not considered a very high priority in the Congress in Washington, D.C. The years passed by, then the decades, and it wasn't until 1881 that Dr. Baldwin succeeded in persuading Congress to make an appropriation to start intervening in the navigational prospects for the entrance to the St. Johns River here. This chart from 1857 gives you a better representation of what the issues were with the sandbar. It took pilots, still does take pilots, by the way, to get large ocean-going vessels safely in and out of the entrance to the river. But pilotage is an old and honorable profession in Jacksonville, especially out here on Batten Island. And there used to be a settlement which will appear on another map that I'll show you later called Pilot Town. And that's where the pilots actually maintained quarters, kept some skiffs and small sailboats with which they could sail out when they saw an approaching vessel and offer their services to the captain and offer to help navigate it safely across the bar. Even with the aid of a pilot, it wasn't always possible. Unfavorable winds, unfavorable currents, shifting sandbars sometimes would make the channel even too shallow under ordinary tidal conditions, and many times a sailing vessel would have to lay off outside the entrance to the river for a day or two or three at a time, and the pilots would just kind of bide their time and wait for the captain to summon them to come in. Sometimes an enterprising captain wanting to save a few bucks would decide, I don't need a pilot, I can get in and out of here all right without any local knowledge, and they would go ahead and chance it on their own. It took a extraordinarily self-confident captain to do that, either the one who was so tight with a nickel that he would risk his cargo and his ship by foregoing pilotage. Dr. Baldwin's efforts faced that ongoing conundrum. This is an example, by the way, of some of the sailing schooners that I'm referring to that were the conventional vessels that traded at Jacksonville. This is a photo taken at the docks downtown in Jacksonville on the St. Johns River. It dates from a bit later in the 19th century, but it's characteristic of the vessels that commonly called at Jacksonville up until the age of the and after the beginning of steamboat navigation. These schooners were particularly useful because they were long, they were narrow, they drew relatively little water. Because of their rigging, instead of having square sails, they had sails that were organized fore and aft. Because of that, they were nimble, and they could navigate more readily than larger ocean-going ships. And they could carry large quantities of Jacksonville's major export at the time. What am I talking about? Lumber, yeah. This area of northeast Florida and southeast Georgia had as one of its principal exports and products pine timber. And pine flatwoods are the indigenous topography of the region, and that accounts for not only Jacksonville's 19th century maritime economy, it accounts for why downtown Jacksonville was mostly built from pine timber, which helps account for how it burned so cheerfully in the Great Fire of 1901, and it helps account for the construction of this church that we're enjoying today, right? So those were the vessels that were typical of the time, and they had enough trouble still navigating in and out of the river. How many are from St. Louis? Anybody in this congregation?
I've been on the Eads Bridge.
Okay, Reverend Martin has been, as he said, if you couldn't hear him, he's been on the Eads Bridge, which is named for this guy, Captain James Eads. Captain Eads was never a captain. He never held any maritime credentials. He never held any maritime rank, and he never took a degree in engineering. He was self-taught at what he did, but he was an extraordinarily thoughtful and innovative and creative and determined character. In addition to being the designer and the advocate for the Eads Bridge, which was the first bridge that successfully crossed the Mississippi River south of its intersection with the Missouri River. That means it was a very wide and dynamic section of the river. Crossing it was really an imposing and ambitious achievement, and Captain Eads accomplished that. It sort of made his reputation as a problem solver with gifts in engineering. He was then soon recruited by the people at the Port of New Orleans to help them solve an intractable problem, which was that the entrance to the river, the Mississippi River at New Orleans, south of the city, kept shoaling in. And it made it difficult and unreliable, same thing as here at St. Johns River, made it difficult and unreliable for ocean-going vessels to navigate in and out of the river. So Captain Eads' innovation, after some thought and survey, was to start building a series of pilings and wooden retaining walls on either side of one of the stretches of the river, the pass that seemed to be, to him, to be the most direct approach. What that did was narrow the course of the water, which increased the velocity of the water that was moving in and out of the river with an outgoing and incoming tide. The increased velocity of the current tended to scour out the bottom of the river. That deepened the river, and in deepening it, that allowed a larger volume of water to come in and out of the river. The larger volume of water then had to move at an even faster rate to be able to fit between the jetties, and that scoured out more of the bottom of the river. Without ever having to touch a dredge, Captain Eads' innovation worked, and it successfully opened the Port of New Orleans to reliable ocean-going transportation. Here in Jacksonville, a group of civic leaders inspired by the ever-persistent Dr. Baldwin got wind of this solution and said, we need that guy here. And they convinced the city of Jacksonville, which, by the way, didn't even come anywhere near out here as far as Fort George Island at the time. Nevertheless, they convinced the city leaders to put up money to pay Captain Eads to come here, survey the situation, make a recommendation. By this point, Captain Eads is pretty sure he's got this, and he saw basically a situation very similar to that obtained in New Orleans, and he recommended a pretty similar innovation in the way of a set of jetties that we now see on either side of the river entrance here at Mayport. Instead of timber, though, he recognized that this is a considerably more dynamic river entrance than that at New Orleans, and so he recommended granite, which inconveniently is not as easy to find in Northeast Florida as pine flatwoods are, but nevertheless, he prescribed a system of granite jetties on either side of the inlet. He started out recommending just one on the north side, just to kind of block that sand flow coming out of our Fort George River. That proved to be not enough, and so it was just a question of continuing to expand the jetties on both sides of the river until enough current velocity was obtained to start doing what the retaining walls had done in New Orleans, scouring out the bottom of the river. And by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the effect had obtained sufficiently that steamboats, which have to keep on a disciplined and tight schedule, could reliably come and go from the river entrance and keep a schedule, show up when they said they would, leave when they promised they would, and that really started to propel the growth of Jacksonville as a successful and sustainable seaport. The jetty construction continued for decades after. Jetty maintenance carries on and continues, and of course, the scouring effect only deepened the channel so far. It has continued in the 20th and 21st century to be necessary to carry out dredging. But if it wasn't for Captain Eads, and if it wasn't for the ambitions of the people of Jacksonville, and if it wasn't for these jetties, I suspect that St. Mary's, Georgia, would be the more important seaport along this stretch of the coast. Jacksonville would probably be a nice little town about the size of Palatka, maybe, something like that. And so many things would be different here. There are certain things that you can point to in the history of a place or a people that are really major and influential inflection points. In Jacksonville's history, I think the single most important event in the city's history downtown was the Great Fire of May 1901, the anniversary of which is just behind us by a week or so, right? But almost equally as important, and it competes in importance, is the construction of the jetties. And they changed the hydrogeology of the river entrance. They also changed the fact that Fort George Island used to be an oceanfront island, and it is now separated from the city by the accreted barrier island where Huguenot Park exists, right down to the present. Those jetties should be named the Eads Jetties. And as long as I'm on the subject of renaming things, that's my suggestion for what to do with them. Well, there you see a 1918 chart that shows the entrance to the river. And unfortunately, you can't see very clearly, but I'll point out here These dark lines illustrate the jetties as they stood in 1918, roughly at the end of the Civil War. You can see the accreting barrier island here, separated slightly from Fort George Island. You can also see a reference to the Pilot Town settlement where that pier is. That had established itself. Fanning Island, Sisters Creek, Sister Island, and Fort George Island here, and Mayport establishing itself here, but not yet a major naval installation. You can also see a rail line that crossed the marshes just south of Mayport and made its way all the way back down the barrier islands to what's now Jacksonville Beach, and then crossed the Pablo Creek at Jacksonville Beach. That rail line had existed since the beginning of the jetty construction, and it was how granite was shipped from southern Georgia and other places, brought to Jacksonville, transferred onto smaller rail cars, brought all the way out to Mayport, and then lightered onto barges, which then took the granite block out to the river entrance, where it was placed to form the jetties. And I thought I had a nice image of the granite being actually placed. Oh, I did. I passed that. Did I not? I think I skipped a slide. There we go. 1900, turn of the century. That's the granite actually being placed at the location of the jetties. And this guy here, looking rather dour with a bushy mustache, is Captain F.W. Bruce. He was the chief of the local Corps of Engineers agency that supervised the construction of those jetties. That was job security for Captain Bruce. That went on for most of the rest of his working career with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm preempting your job here, John. How am I doing? And for mariners, of which there are several in the audience here, I believe, right? This is a pretty familiar sight. Captain O'Connor can't be here. He texted me a little while ago and pleaded illness. He and Glenda came back from Europe with some kind of sinusitis, I guess. So maybe they're streaming this. Hi, Scott, if you can see. But this is a familiar sight to him and everybody else who has navigated in and out of the river. And you can see the effect. You can also see the tendency of sand to accrete on the north side of the jetty. You can see the entrance to Naval Station Mayport here at the left, and you can see the powerful currents that sweep around the end of the jetties. As Scott O'Connor has explained to me, when large vessels are approaching the jetties and the river entrance from out in the channel out at the sea buoy, they have to account for the tendency of the current to sweep to the right. They steer up a little bit, but they have to be alert to correct that as they pass in between the jetties and straighten out, and then make their way toward the first big bend in the river.
So Huguenot and that lagoon did not exist before the jetties?
That's right. Yeah, Fort George Island was, as it's represented in the old maps, which I'll show you in a moment, it was Fort George Island represented itself as really an oceanfront barrier island community with miles of beautiful sandy beaches. And now some of that's probably hyperbole, and I'll read you a little hyperbole here in a bit when we get to some of the real estate ambitions. So this, I'm showing you this just to kind of put Fort George Island in the context of Duval County in the years immediately after the Great Fire. You can see that Jacksonville really doesn't take up a huge amount of county space. Now it takes up the entire county, right? Since the consolidated government took effect in 1968, this has become the largest city in landmass of any city in the lower 48 states of the United States. It is by far the largest city in Florida. It's the largest city in Florida in population now, having over 1 million people for the first time in the 2020 census. It outstrips its nearest competitor by 100%. The next closest city in population in Florida is the city of Miami at about 500,000. That's not counting the entire Miami metropolitan area, but nevertheless, this is a big government. And it was a much different proposition in the early 1900s, in the years before the Civil War. And here is a crop, a little bit of a close-up now from the northeastern quadrant. And I'm showing you this just to illustrate that Fort George Island and Little Talbot Island really still dominated this north side of the river entrance here. And you'll notice also that they were really separated from the rest of Jacksonville. You had to come by boat if you were going to come from Jacksonville out to the island. And that was part of its appeal. It was part of what helped impede and discourage significant amount of development out here on the island. On the other hand, it made it a pretty attractive destination and a respite for northern visitors, Yankees, as some are pleased to call them, and people from Jacksonville who lived in the city but who were looking for a place to get away from the heat of the city in the summertime. One good example of those being Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, more about him in a few minutes, but he built a house here on Batten Island, or Fort George Island, depending on how you differentiate the geography. And that home was his idea of a place where he and his family could get away from the heat of the city. But it was easy for him. He was a boat owner. He was a boat captain. He owned at least one tugboat. He had owned and operated a number of others. So did his brother Montcalm Broward. And Montcalm and Napoleon built matching identical houses right next to each other. Montcalm's house is no longer standing, but when you visit, if you visit Captain Broward's, Governor Broward's house, just imagine a house identical to it standing immediately to the south of it, fronting on what's now Heckscher Drive.
And that's the house by the entrance to the,
That's the house where we turn to come onto Fort George Road to come out to church. Yep, and I'll show an image of that again in a moment. Here's another shot from that 1906 map that shows the jetties in place, shows the Pilot Town location, and shows Fort George Island, really with nothing between it and the Atlantic Ocean, right, and Mayport here. But you can see a somewhat discouraging topography for people who want to hike or bike or even consider taking a horse-drawn carriage out to Fort George Island. Yeah, automobiles were around, but that was kind of a non-starter as early as 1906. That would change soon enough, though. By the way, take note of the New Berlin settlement, never an incorporated town, but visible here just past the Big Bend in the river. You can see the Mill Cove area and Drummond Point and the bend around what's now the northern tip of Arlington, and the Cosmo settlement right here on the inside of the bend at Mill Cove. Cosmo, famous as a community established by freed slaves, people who had acquired land as a result of General William Tecumseh Sherman's General Field Order number 46 that famously awarded 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves along the barrier islands, the oceanfront communities of this region. Another image of the jetties. In the contemporary period, you can see Mayport Naval Basin and the Navy Station, the airstrip, and Fort George Island, and now, of course, the accreting barrier island, secondary to Fort George Island, that starts to separate it from the ocean itself. This is the oldest map that I can find readily that shows how Fort George Island began to be a real estate development during the same years that Dr. Baldwin and others were trying to contrive a way to tame the entrance to the St. Johns River. So in the years after the end of the Civil War, the island had been acquired by an investor from up north, a Yankee again. He bought it in 1869 for $5,500 at a sheriff's auction. And he bought it with the idea in mind that it would be, this is the dream that all Northerners have when they come to Florida, it's going to be a real estate development. And he would get rich selling lots to fellow Yankees and maybe a few, desperately impoverished Southerners here and there along the way. But it would nevertheless, as so many places in the state are, be a real estate sort of windfall for him. He started developing plats and divided the property up into lots. You can see the Fort George River inlet here, and the intent at that point was also to start developing oceanfront lots. And advancing the slide here, we can see in a zoom a little bit better glimpse of how the property was beginning to take shape. People who are students of Fort George Island know that there used to be a hotel on the island. It had about 60 rooms, the Fort George Island Hotel, and the site of it appears on this map, the Fort George Hotel right here. And it was represented as being a short walk to the ocean beach. It's not crystal clear to me from any of the maps how short that walk was, but nevertheless it was represented as being a beautiful and delightful respite for visitors. And the site that is known as Mount Cornelia is just immediately to the north. Well, let's see, the north arrow is a little bit off the chart here. North is that way, so Mount Cornelia just a little bit north of the site of what was the hotel. And you can see a lot of relatively small lots being planted here. Almost none of those lots were sold. An economic recession that had begun in the early 1870s really impeded the success of any real estate developments along the scale of what the developer, Mr. Rollins, sought. But you can see in this zoom a little bit closer the location of the hotel, the location of Mount Cornelia, and I believe, it's not shown on this map, but I believe that the site of our church is a little bit further back up toward this cove, and we'll see a representation of that a bit later. Next slide, please. Ten years later, a real estate development company in which the Rollins family were still involved, by the way, organized itself as the Fort George Island Company, and they prepared this really detailed, lavishly illustrated, and carefully written pamphlet about Fort George Island. And this is an image from just inside the front cover, and it shows what they were representing as the biggest asset, sort of the proof that Fort George Island was a happening place and a desirable destination, this hotel. And you can see the representation of Mount Cornelius in the background. Sometimes called Mount Cornelia, sometimes Mount Cornelius. I've seen it rendered both ways. Represented, by the way, in the literature of the Fort George Island Company and elsewhere as being the highest point along the Atlantic Ocean islands south of New Jersey. That's always struck me as being a question that's worth researching, and it turns out that it appears that what's called Mount Cornelia actually was a indigenous people's shell midden, so artificially created, but nevertheless a high point and surveyed at about 60 feet or so. There are higher points along the barrier islands south of New Jersey. I say this with all due respect to the legend of Mount Cornelia and the denizens of Fort George Island, but Kill Devil Hill, for example, about 4 miles south of Kitty Hawk on the barrier islands in North Carolina, stands at 91 feet above sea level. And it was partly on account of that height and partly on account of the reliable winds from coming in from offshore that the Wright brothers chose that as the location for their experiments with their early aircraft. So this is a pair of pages from the book, and I chose to copy. All of this, by the way, is available online at the Florida Memory website. It's maintained by the State Archives of Florida. And if you've got any kind of an appetite to get sort of a glimpse at what the expectations and ambitions were for Fort George Island in the late 19th century, I encourage you to hop online and just take a look at this. It's fascinating reading. It's got a number of really cool illustrations. The narrative is practically purple in its passionate description of this place, and I'll read an excerpt from that in a moment. And I'm going to be quoting from the paragraph at the beginning of this chapter, An Island of Roses, but I was intrigued, of course, because it has an early illustration from about 1888 of our church. And if you'll scroll ahead one slide, John, there's a zoom of that representation of the church from the pamphlet, A Winter at Fort George, Florida. So, bear with me while I read briefly from the entrance, from the opening of that chapter. It says, At Fort George Island, above any other spot in America, one is impressed with the fact that the hand of the Creator has lavished upon flowers all the resources of his infinite skill. It is simply impossible to describe the beautiful grasses, vines, and flowers which decorate and perfume this paradise of the sea. Where, quoting from apparently a bit of poetic composition, where gentle gales, fanning their odoriferous wings, dispense native perfumes and whisper whence they stole those balmy spoils. The whole pamphlet goes on like that. And apparently a representation of St. George Episcopal Church was not enough to cement the connection with the infinite wisdom of the Creator. We had to lay in a little bit of botanical science and reference. And then they go on, by the way, to assert that medical science has well determined that the odor of pine and some of the other indigenous blossoming plants on Fort George Island have long since been proven to cure, and then they proceeded to list a number of different diseases that could be cured. So what could possibly go wrong? Any mention of gnats, mosquitoes, flies, no-see-ums, completely absent from the real estate promoter's prose. Let's see. Next slide, please, John, if you don't mind. So this is almost at the end of the pamphlet, and here's where the brass tacks of a little business comes into play. Here the Fort George Island Company is listing all the advantages, briefly recapitulated. Its magnificent beaches, celebrated land river, exemption from malaria, its warm sulfur springs, freedom from fogs and dampness, its pure water, its Mount Cornelia Park, its miles of ocean frontage, and so on. Its magnificent semi-tropical forest, its pure ocean breezes tempered by the Gulf Stream, which continually bathe this magical island, and its fine new hotel. The authors of this were people who never spent the summer on Fort George Island, I'm pretty sure. But they were happy to quote prices for lots. So prices for lots, and most of the lots were divided at a size of 100 feet wide by 150 feet deep. So about a 15,000 square foot lot, a pretty good sized residential lot, right? Prices started at $100 each and went up from there depending on location. The highest priced lot on their price list, which is on the page at the left, came in at $800 each. And just for reference, in $1888, $100 would equate in the present day in 2024 to $3,287 and a few odd cents here and there. Still a pretty outrageously good deal, right?
Oh,
Even
man.
if, yeah, no kidding.
I'll get one of each of these.
Just give me a dozen. The price seems unbelievably low now. It still seemed pretty accessible at the time, and the deal went nowhere. And the real estate development continued to languish. It was not the end of the line for ambitious real estate developers, but each successive attempt to convert Fort George Island into a mecca of home ownership and a community of homeowners and people who would enjoy its many benefits. Each one of those attempts really stumbled and failed for a number of different reasons. There probably, in my estimation, it might have been a little bit more feasible to try for something along the lines of a resort type community similar to St. Simons or Jekyll Island in Georgia, but those developments also faced a pretty uphill battle and some pretty strong headwinds before they really became successful and popular later on in the 20th century. Well, next slide, please, John. I mentioned Governor Broward. This larger-than-life character packed more into his short 53 years of life than almost anybody that I'm aware of in this part of Northeast Florida. A sheriff, a mariner, a successful gun runner, by the way, 19th governor of the state of Florida, won election in 1910, to succeed a U.S. senator who had died in office, and Governor Broward, unfortunately, also passed away before he could be sworn in and take office as a United States senator from this state. He fell ill while at his home here on Fort George Island, and in his illness he had to be transported to more skilled medical care, so couldn't get there over land, so a boat came and fetched him from the dock right across from the house and took him up to downtown, where he moved into the house of relatives in what's now the Springfield area, and died after about 3 weeks. He's buried, as I mentioned, in Evergreen Cemetery. So is his brother and other relatives, some of his children. There are several branches of the Broward family, 2 basic branches here in Duval County. Some of the Broward developments just north of the Trout River and north of the St. Johns River Bend were developed by others in the Broward family. And they're buried in separate plots at Evergreen Cemetery, separated by a couple of streets and several other family burial sites. One of my board members of the History Center is Christina Broward Barnes. She's the daughter of the late Jacksonville architect Robert Broward. And I asked her one day, what's with these Browards? I mean, they're all related. How come they're buried in different plots? And she shook her head sadly and said, those people hated each other. They did not want to be buried close to each other. It was enough that they be buried in the same cemetery. But she said, my dad and our descendants, who are descended from Pulaski Broward, we're buried on the south side of the river, far enough away from the rest of them. She doesn't have any animosity toward the older Browards, but it's just testimony to the fact that family relationships are not always the smoothest and most sanguine.
Tell us about the gun smuggling, you know what
Yeah, so Governor Broward, at that time, he had previously been the sheriff of Duval County, a skilled mariner. He and some partners operated a tugboat called the Three Friends. And tugboats at the time were really more than just what we see as the sort of harbor tugs that push ships around in port, and more than what you see as the ocean-going tugs that drag large ocean-going barges back and forth between Jacksonville and San Juan, Puerto Rico. Tugboats actually were put into a multitude of different, very practical uses. Yeah, they made their bread and butter by dragging schooners, unmotorized sailing schooners up and down the river from their timber port landings and sawmills up the river down to the river entrance. That was sort of, the way that Governor Broward, as a young man, started making his living on the river, operating the tug and operating as a bar pilot. He became successful politically, served a term as sheriff, was controversial, was thrown out of office by the governor of Florida, who was a political adversary. I'm reminded, by the way, politics are bitter and divisive, and there's lots of animosity and contempt toward people with whom we disagree in the 21st century. I'm not so sure that it hasn't really very often been this way in U.S. history. It's awful now. I mean, it certainly is awful, and I think social media has a lot to account for that. But nevertheless, it has always been kind of a robust tradition in American democracy that you advocate your own goodness because of what you believe and the awfulness of anybody who doesn't think what you think. That was true in the late 19th century, and Governor Broward relished the political combat of the day. He also was an entrepreneur, and he also saw an opportunity to help another fledgling democracy, the people of the Spanish colony of Cuba, who were revolting against the King of Spain. Cuba was still a Spanish territory in the late 19th century. And the Cuban revolutionaries needed guns. Governor Broward, being a former sheriff, knew how to get guns. Being the owner of an ocean-going tugboat, he knew how to carry guns to Cuba, and it didn't take a great leap of imagination for him and his partners in the Three Friends to think, we can do something good for our brethren in Cuba and make a few bucks along the way. And so he made several trips. It was called filibustering, which was a polite term for gun smuggling. He made several trips back and forth to the area around what's now known as Guantanamo Bay, and smuggled weapons into the Cuban revolutionaries. Needless to say, the King of Spain and the Spanish Navy got wind of Governor Broward's efforts, and they tried many times to interdict him and capture the guns and seize the boat and capture Governor Broward. He wasn't the governor yet at the time. He was just a mariner who was pleased to say he had once been the sheriff. But nevertheless, he made himself a local hero, even though what he was doing was strictly illegal. And he would have been arrested if he had been caught by the authorities representing the federal government. But being a local hero and being a skillful mariner and knowing the waters around here, he was never caught by anybody in a position of authority, at least not while he had guns on board the three friends. And so he never hid the fact, by the way, that he had done this. He was pretty proud of it, and he got sort of a lot of informal populist, yeah, you go guy, support for being this salty, populist-minded, and adventuresome mariner. He made himself, as I say, a bit of a hero. It was partly on the strength of that he became more prominent and eventually won re-election to another term as sheriff. Yes, a widely known gun smuggler elected as sheriff of Duval County. The city has great traditions, and he made his home, as I say, at least his summer home. Next slide, please, John. In the house that we now recognize as being at the entrance to Fort George Island. And that's a picture from the State Archives from 1969. You can see that, from the coloration in the picture, it looks a little bit older. You can also see that some of the features of the house that were there in '69 no longer stand. The screen porch along the front, the door, all of that gone now. The little filigrees, in many cases, no longer extant. But the house, pretty similar to the way it was. In 1969, it was still occupied by Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, a son, the only son, by the way, of the late Governor Broward, who lived there for the rest of his life. When he died in 1989, the property became part of the state and became part of now the Timucuan Ecological Preserve, and the offices of the foundation are actually located in the house. They're embarked on a project to restore it and open it up for public access. It's probably going to be a couple of years before they get that done. Next slide, please, John. Oh, back up one, sorry. Notice the widow's walk on top of the house. This was a tradition for sea captains to have on houses. You see it in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard up north. You see it on the roof of the Kingsley Plantation House. And this one here on Governor Broward's house, accessible through the attic, through a staircase inside. And I had the good fortune to get up there back in January. Next slide, please. And where the view used to allow for observation of ships offshore at the entrance to the river, now it allows for observation of the dry stack marina at the Fort George Island. Next slide, please, John.
So you don't want to bask in the glory of the dry stack?
We can come back to that. I took the preceding picture, and I also took this one on my visit in January. The rest of the back of the house, if you walk out to the dock that extends out into Clapboard Creek, you may be forgiven for believing that you had actually stepped back to the 19th century. And that's, I mean, isn't that really one of the stunning things that makes us so lucky to live in this part of Florida? The preserve, Little and Big Talbot Islands, the drive up Heckscher to Nassau Sound and over onto Amelia Island. It's as close as any of us can get in the 21st century to a glimpse of what Florida looked like before it became 20th century Florida and modern Florida. It's also true of the Guantanamo Ecological Preserve south of Jacksonville Beach, south of Ponte Vedra, that runs roughly from South Ponte Vedra down to Volano Beach. That stretch of the coastline and that stretch of the waterway, like ours up here, one of the few remaining examples of what Florida used to look like. Next slide, please. So these are, the Broward descendants get together every once in a while and come visit the old homestead. Chris Barnes came out with one of her sons about a year and a half or two ago for a Broward family reunion. I was invited, of course. We were hosted, I shouldn't say of course, I don't get invited to everything, but I happened to be included in that get-together, as I was in this visit by some Broward descendants. And they were reminiscing about all manner of childhood episodes. They came out and visited their Uncle Napoleon, the son of Governor Broward, when they were children, and they reminisced about the crazy uncles, of which Napoleon was one, but there were a number of others. And in this picture, we see the Browards, and the guy standing here at the middle with his back to us, looking up at the tree, is former State Senate President Jeff Atwater, also the former Chief Financial Officer of the state of Florida. He is a Hardee, which was the name of one of Governor Broward's daughters, who married a Hardee related to another former governor of Florida in the 1920s, Carrie Hardee. I guess this is proof that in Senator Atwater, the acorn does not fall far from the gigantic oak. But Senator Atwater, Jeff, and his cousins here were reminiscing about being encouraged by one of their sort of creepy uncles to engage in fist fights underneath the tree in the backyard. I guess that helps account for a combative personality. But that's an example of one of the reasons why we encourage the historic preservation of old buildings and old places that can help tell the stories about the people and events that came before us. That's part of the work that I do with the Jacksonville History Center. And not all old buildings can be saved. Not all of them are worth saving. They really still have to serve some sort of a sustainable purpose in the 21st century. But when they do survive and when they can be sustained, they add a lot to our sense of the distinctiveness of a place. There are so many places in the 21st century United States where you take a look at any interstate freeway interchange, right? You could be anywhere in the country. The similarities of the built environment look almost identical. So the things that really distinguish a place and make it unique to itself are the things that are really worth advocating for and preserving. And places like the Broward House are just one example. So too is the next slide, please, John. The Rebo Club, just down the road from here, built in the late 1920s as an exclusive club. And building something like this to be an exclusive development or exclusive club in the late 1920s in Florida, that took an extraordinary amount of courage, fortitude, and kind of a gambling spirit. Florida had entered into what we call the Great Florida Real Estate Crash by 1926. Now, Jacksonville didn't suffer from it as badly as the rest of the state did. If there are any of you long-suffering readers of the Times-Union who happened to see my column that ran a week ago on Sunday, you read a little bit about how I argue that Jacksonville actually survived the Great Crash better than most of the rest of the state did. But nevertheless, the Rebo Club came onto the scene at probably the worst moment economically for its fortunes, and indeed it struggled to keep its doors open, keep its membership alive through the worst of the years of the Great Depression, and then through the years of the Second World War, when it was used in part for officers' quarters for military veterans serving in the Jacksonville area. And then at the end of World War II, went into a state of languishing again. And it was purchased in 1946, just after the end of the Second World War, by a guy named Paul Reinhold, the chief executive officer of Foremost Dairies, which was a national dairy operation at the time. He and a number of other Jacksonville businessmen, Walter McCrae, a well-known automobile dealer whose descendants are still in the car business here in Jacksonville, Frank Norris of Barnett Bank's fame, and a number of other investors all pooled their money in 1946, bought the Rebo Club, bought the remnants of the old golf course, which had been very sketchily maintained. And they intended to relaunch the club, which they tried to do, and also to, guess what, develop real estate and sell home sites and turn it into a successful development. The relaunch of the club failed. They set a goal of 400 members, which would be the minimum number necessary to sustain it financially. They failed to get that in business. One by one, Mr. McCrae, Mr. Norris, and about the other 6 or so investors lost interest in the project and abandoned their investment. Finally, it came down to Paul Reinhold and Walter McCrae. In 1954, both of them were fed up, and so they made a deal. One of them, they would both name a price at which they would either buy or sell the other guy's interests out. And McCrae named a price that Paul Reinhold thought was acceptable, so Reinhold bought McCrae out, and Reinhold became the sole owner of the property from 1954 onward. In 1959, he decided to relaunch the club. That effort failed. In 1961, the club closed again. In 1968, still hoping to get some of his investment back, still hoping to sell lots and create a subdivision, he expanded the golf course from its original 9 holes to an 18-hole course. I'm told that the 8th hole and the 9th tee were on top of Mount Cornelius, which makes me speculate about the joy of shagging balls off the top of the mountain out over the swamp and the marshland. The golf course continued to operate, and it was open to access by the public through the 1960s and into the 1970s and into the 1980s. And I talked to lots of people who remember the golf course from their earlier years and will say things like, yeah, I used to make money as a kid going out and finding balls in the woods and selling them back to golfers and that sort of enterprise. In 1981, with Mr. Reinhold in failing health, his daughter Ann took over the interests of the Foremost Corporation. She optioned the golf course, the surrounding acreage, and the club to Fairfield Communities. They proposed to develop a resort along the lines of a Jekyll Island or St. Simon's Island style resort, and they closed on the purchase of the property in 1985. Mr. Reinhold's ambitions for real estate development met with lots of local opposition from property owners on the island and concerned citizens around Northeast Florida, who by that point in the 1960s, with rising environmental consciousness, began to appreciate the sensitivity of this area, this land, and the island, and they bitterly opposed any kind of permitting to support that. And the Fairfield Communities Plan in the mid-1980s was in for even more vociferous, really embittered opposition. Their plans never came to fruition, and in 1989, they sold the property out to the state of Florida, a transaction that was guided and shepherded and supported by our late governor, Bob Graham, who just passed away a few weeks ago, sadly. But during his term of office, he, once again, as Governor Broward before him and others, kind of had his hands in the future of this island. One of the members, next slide please, one of the early members of the Rebo Club was this guy, August Heckscher, and a name that's familiar to anybody who ever gets on the street to drive to Fort George Island and can come to church here. Mr. Heckscher, a German immigrant who came to the United States as a young man and became a very successful industrialist and entrepreneur and real estate developer in the Northeast, in the New England area. And like many, he fled the bitter winters of the North and found his way to Jacksonville, which he found much more to his liking in the winter, discovered Fort George Island, became a member at the Rebo Club, and thought, man, I can help promote this place. And so he built a toll road to cross the creeks and connect Jacksonville with Fort George Island. The toll road initially came just as far as the entrance to what we now call Fort George Road. But that road project turned out to be successful enough that after his death in 1941, the road was purchased by the state of Florida. They took over maintenance, improved the bridges, and after a number of years named it after Mr. Heckscher. Next slide, please, John. Thank you. I can hardly improve on the narrative of this historic site marker, but I'll try to throw in a few things that I think merit some discussion. There's mention, of course, here on both sides of this marker, which, by the way, is at the Fort George Island Club. Hope Charon found it, Mick Charon found it after we were having a conversation. A number of us remembered seeing the marker, but we couldn't remember exactly where it was, so thanks, Hope, for pointing that out. And so this will look familiar to you. She actually went and read it over not too long ago. You can visit the marker and read the narrative. But I'll point out that we are just down the street from one of the most important historic sites anywhere in Jacksonville or Duval County, and that's the Kingsley Plantation. Now that story I could go on about for easily 45 minutes or an hour, and that's not really within the scope of today's talk, but I would just mention that it became the home of Zephaniah Kingsley and his African-born Senegalese wife, originally bought by him as a slave, then emancipated in 1811 and married, and she bore him a number of children. She also became like Mr. Kingsley, her husband, became a slave owner, a slave trader, and like Mr. Kingsley, emancipated a number of her slaves. Anybody who thinks the story of slavery in the southeastern United States is a simple story has a second thought or two to do. It became a fabulously complicated network of economics and society and family relations, and a story all by itself, well worth reading if you get a chance. The standard book on this subject was written by my former UNF history colleague, Professor Dan Schaefer, who wrote a book about Anna Kingsley, and strongly recommend that. Zephaniah and Anna Kingsley moved to the island in about 1814 when it was part of Spain. The house that we now call the Kingsley Plantation House had actually been built by a previous property owner named McQueen. So it was the old McQueen house, and you can still see, of course, the evidence of that architecture and construction. It still stands now as the oldest existing building anywhere in Duval County and in Jacksonville. Fortunately, it's not an endangered building. It's well preserved and owned, as I've said, by the state, and a tremendous opportunity for the interpretation of this place and so many interesting topics in Jacksonville history. The Kingsleys came to Florida and came to this island, as I said, during the Spanish period. The Spanish period ended just about 7 years later in 1821 when the Spanish Empire relinquished its Florida colony to the United States. The Hayes-Onis Treaty of 1821 consummated another great big real estate deal, which is endemic to characteristic of Florida history. And this became part of the United States. Up until then, people like the Kingsleys and everybody else who lived in Northeast Florida and in what's now Jacksonville had been subjects of the King of Spain. They had to adapt to being citizens of the United States, not a state, a territory at that point. Florida didn't become a state until 1845. But nevertheless, this was a place where it was possible for people of color to make the transition from a condition of enslavement to becoming citizens in whole. They could become full-fledged citizens. It was an easier path in Spanish Florida if they professed the one true faith. What am I talking about? The Catholic faith, right? That was sort of a guaranteed route to manumission, to emancipation. It wasn't the only path, but things began to change rapidly after this became part of the United States. In the 1820s and by the 1830s, Florida, like the rest of the American South, was becoming increasingly hostile to people of color, and the rights of citizenship that had obtained as recently as the early 1820s, one by one, began to fall away. People could no longer work independently. They could no longer be independent contractors. They could no longer vote. They could no longer own real property. The rights began to fall away. Mr. Kingsley and Anna recognized the trend, and they fled Florida for another plantation colony that they had established in what's now Haiti in the contemporary period, and that's where they made their home until Anna Kingsley bravely returned to Florida, a slave state by then, and tried to reclaim her properties. Again, a story that's well worth studying for its complications. Well, next slide, please, John. After the Civil War, I'm getting back to the chronology of the jetties and the port and the rest here, but after the Civil War, a a entrepreneur from New Hampshire named John Rollins bought Fort George Island, as I mentioned earlier, for $5,500 at a sheriff's sale. He took over and moved into the abandoned Kingsley Plantation house, and he and his wife renamed it and called it the Homestead. And he, like others before him and since then, sought to develop home sites and convert this into a residential community. In 1875, he and his business partners built the Fort George Hotel, where they also initiated Episcopal church services for the first time. The congregation that we now claim as the St. George congregation worshiped there at the behest of John Rollins' wife, Hannah Rollins, a devout Episcopalian herself. She deeded a parcel of property close to the hotel to the Episcopal Diocese, the Diocese of Florida, intending that it would be the site of a permanent church. Well, that site and the church idea and the home site idea and the real estate development all languished, as I mentioned, in the face of an economic recession. Then another investor related to the development company named Ellen Ward, another immigrant from the north, made a gift of $1,500 to the Diocese of Florida. She gave it into the care of the then Episcopal Bishop of Florida, John Freeman Young, with the stipulation that it be used to build a church on a new site, which is this site. Hannah Rollins, the wife of John Rollins, who had already deeded a site for the church near the hotel, was absent from the island and out of communication with goings-on with the diocese, and she returned from a visit to the north, came back to her home at the homestead, and was astonished to see that there was a new church, an Episcopal church, on the island, which she thought of as her island, but not in the place where she intended for it to be. And the animosities persisted for the rest of the lives of Ms. Rollins and also Ms. Ward. Ms. Rollins never worshiped at this congregation inside the walls of this church until after Ellen Ward had passed away. She wouldn't darken the doors of the church. It's testimony, is it not, to the antagonisms that can spring up not just in families but in church families and church congregations. And I mean, we see this in every denomination. I see your hand, Rita. I'll get to you. It's testimony to the divisions and the schisms and the conflict that can arise, and that's true of every denomination. It's true of every faith. It is kind of peculiar, though, and always strikes me to see that in a congregation that professes the Christian faith. We have no premium on that sort of thing, but it just makes me think that that our Savior, Jesus Christ, is somewhere shaking his head and thinking they still just don't get my message. They're still trying to figure it out. Rita, yes. Yes, she eventually forgave. Yeah. Yeah. I'm told that she did, but not until Ms. Ward had passed from the scene. Yeah.
I'll tell you a story about harmony of this congregation. My great aunt lived in one of the pilot houses. And Gladys Rivers.
Lived in what? I'm sorry?
One of the pilot houses.
Okay.
Burned down. She was Catholic. She was minority. She played the piano here on Sundays for her friends. Got in her car and drove to St. Michael's to a Catholic mass. They all got along back then.
Well, speaking of apostasies in the congregation, one of the most colorful political characters in Florida's political history, certainly in the 20th century, was a guy named Claude Kirk. Anybody ever heard of the late Governor Kirk? He was the CEO of the American Heritage Life Insurance Company based in Jacksonville, and I'm told, this is entirely anecdotal, but I'm told that in the 1960s, before he became involved in electoral politics, He was the lay leader of the congregation here at St. George, and apparently read from the scripture and delivered what passed for a Claude Kirk sermon, which I would give anything to hear in present life. And it's also reported that the years of the 1960s were sort of the nadir of the life and vibrancy of this congregation. It came close to failing in its role as a mission, probably some of the stormiest periods in its history. And knowing what I do about the late Governor Kirk, who I did have the good fortune to meet late in his life, I would lay the blame for all of that at the door of Governor Kirk. Well, this is an extraordinary space, and it's an extraordinary chance for me to make a couple of observations about churches. They are places that take on a huge role in the lives and the lived and the inherited memories of the people who visit them. And even if it's somebody who's a relative newcomer to the congregation like me, or if it's somebody who has worshiped in that place for their whole lives, we are in a place whose walls and floors and ceilings are full of the stories of people who have occupied it, in the case of this church, over generations. It is a place, more than almost any other in the lives of humans, where they come intentionally, bringing their heartbreak, their fear, their confusion, their uncertainty, their bewilderment, sometimes nothing more than just a simple appetite for spiritual companionship. In some cases, it's the place where they come to experience the happiest days of their lives. And it all happens in a place like this. And that makes us the stewards and custodians in the present, right, of a place that really evokes such tremendous and rich history. It's a privilege to experience that, and to try to do it in a way that is faithful to what Christ and all of his servants, all of his people would most like for us to do in the contemporary moment. So that's a good place to stop. A little bit about this church, and thanks to all of you for being a long-suffering and attentive audience. And I appreciate it. Oh, one more. I think there's one more slide. Yeah, I was going to conclude. While I was talking about this church, I was going to show these images of it. Are we not lucky to be here? I mean, the purple prose of that 1878 real estate brochure, in many ways, it really doesn't do justice to the stunning beauty of this place. So another reason why we're lucky to be here. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Bruce? We don't know. Yeah, it was a log fort, and there's no vestigial remnant of it. Yeah, so your guess is as good as anybody else's. Yeah.
Didn't Mr. Hector build all the fish camps? And then when he passed, the money rent would go to a Jewish boys club?
That story I never heard. There, I don't know. Yeah, if you've got a good source for that story, I'd be interested to hear it. Okay, well. Well, she's your mother. She must be a saint. Other thoughts or comments? Thanks, everyone.